Bienvenue tout le monde à notre deuxième édition des séminaires du Département de Biologie. Cette semaine, on a continué notre essai en ligne, puis on a plusieurs co-participants avec nous d'un petit peu partout à Montréal et ailleurs dans le monde, donc bienvenue à tous. C'est un plaisir d'avoir Tonya DelSontro avec nous cette semaine. Tonya vient du New Jersey, où elle a fait ses études en biologie au bac là-bas. C'est entre autres une fan de Bon Jovi, est-ce que j'entends Et comme plusieurs personnes... Puis comme plusieurs personnes en biologie, elle a voyagé beaucoup pour ses études. Elle a pris une tangente aussi qui s'est éloignée un peu de la biologie, mais qui réconcilie les thèmes. Elle m'a enseigné toute l'inspiration. Puis elle est allée faire une maîtrise à l'Université de Santa Barbara pour regarder, il y a des phénomènes, pour ceux qui sont déjà allés, quand on marche sur la plage là-bas, on peut voir des taches d'huile, des méthanes, seeping, des remontées, si on veut, il y a des ouvrages géologiques, suintement. Elle a fait sa maîtrise là-dessus pour ensuite aller en Suisse, à ETH Zurich, dans spécialement le groupe aquatique Yawar. Yawar. That's the German version. Groupe extrêmement renommé internationalement où elle a étudié les différentes voies biogéochimiques qui relient le milieu terrestre, les émissions, les processus d'émission, de production, d'émission de méthane dans les systèmes aquatiques. Entre autres choses, Tonya est très reconnue pour ses travaux sur l'ébullition du méthane. Une voie émergente qui est de plus en plus reconnue pour les émissions de méthane à travers le monde. Puis, en ce moment, depuis quelques années, depuis 2 ans environ, elle est postdoc à l'UQAM avec Paul Giorgio et où elle est en train de continuer à développer son programme de recherche, cette fois-ci plutôt sur les lacs boréaux. Donc, c'est là où elle en est. Elle va aussi avoir une entrevue la semaine prochaine à l'Université de Calgary où elle va présenter son programme de recherche. Donc, c'est une bonne occasion de partager avec nous cette vision pour sa recherche à venir dans les 5 prochaines années. So it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, I'm going to pre-apologize for, I have a little bit of a cold, so I might be coughing in between. I apologize. But yes, thank you again for that nice introduction. I assume you said nice things about me. I understood some of it. But I'll be giving you basically a summary of the last 10 years of my academic career and research from my PhD onward, which has been addressing the uncertainties in methane emissions from natural and impounded waters. So I'm going to start a little bit back slightly in history, and so forgive me for any limnologists out here if this seems a bit trivial. But this right here is basically a classic representation of what inland waters were thought of in the global in their role in the global carbon cycle. Up to about the early 1990s. So essentially, the terrestrial biosphere would be taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, converting it to biomass. Some of it would be converted back into CO2 through respiration, but a dominant part of it would just be carried along inland waters out to the ocean. So essentially, a former paradigm was that inland waters were just passive conduits for carbon, transferring it from the land to the oceans. However, in the 90s, there was a lot of research coming out that showed that when you went to go measure CO2 in a lake, that they were supersaturated with CO2. So essentially, these lakes were emitting carbon from their surfaces. And the balance between primary production and respiration in the lakes could not account for all of this CO2. So there must have been terrestrial carbon being converted and respired in these lakes as well. In the 2000s, we started to notice, researchers started to see that lakes were also supersaturated in methane, another carbonic greenhouse gas. Methane, though, however, you can already see is a little bit more complicated than CO2. It is slightly different than CO2 in many ways. It's produced anaerobically. In anaerobic environments, the carbon sources could be from primary production or terrestrial carbon, what have you. Methane is typically diffused out from the sediments, but it also has this unique ability to form bubbles. Methane is a much more insoluble gas than CO2, so at high rates of production, it likes to go into its free gaseous form and forms bubbles. What's unique about that, or what's important about that pathway, is that it then allows methane to bypass the major sink for methane in waters with oxygen, which is oxidation. So methane in the presence of oxygen will be converted to CO2 at high rates. So this makes methane a very different gas, a very important gas, and a very complex gas. But the amount of research we've done on it so far is about 10 to 15 years behind what we've been doing with CO2 in waters. But regardless, by the end of the 2000s, we were ushered into this new era where the paradigm was now that inland waters were no longer these passive conduits of carbon from the terrestrial to the ocean, the terrestrial environment to the oceans, but instead that inland waters were active carbon transporters. Essentially, there's still the carbon coming from the land through our waters. A bit of it will be transported out to the oceans. Some of it will be buried in sediments in inland waters, and a large portion will be evaded from the surfaces of our inland waters as the carbonic greenhouse gases of CO2 and methane. And like I said just previously, methane, we are a little bit behind the curve on the research that goes into methane, and one of the reasons is that there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding it, the measurement of methane and its pathways. But methane, while it's on the whole emitted at far less quantities than CO2, it's an extremely important gas because it has a much higher global warming potential than CO2. At about 34 times the rate, it's able to trap heat much more efficiently than CO2 on shorter time scales. This makes it a very important gas to consider, which is why now in global carbon budgets, methane is lakes, and methane emissions from lakes are now considered part of global carbon budgets. This one, for example, from the Global Carbon Project came out, these estimates came out just last month. And you can see here that for natural emissions of methane to our atmosphere, wetlands are still the dominant source. And then there's this other category, basically, where it includes things like lakes, but geologic sources, termites, ocean, etc. But this other source essentially has the highest amount of uncertainty. And the biggest part of that uncertainty comes from the lake estimates. We are very, very uncertain when it comes to how much methane is actually coming from lakes. What I also want to point out with this global budget here is that in the anthropogenic sources, we have fossil fuels and agriculture and waste. But what you do not see there are reservoirs. Reservoirs being when we dam rivers and create large water surfaces for the production of hydropower or other reservoir purposes such as drinking or agriculture. However, reservoirs are not included in this, despite the fact that it is a body of water just like lakes are. And there's also been quite a bit of work done over the last few decades looking at the greenhouse gas emission potential from hydropower reservoirs as well, which is definitely challenging this clean and green energy aspect of hydropower. This, however, has become somewhat of a political as well as a socioeconomic issue for many countries. That's a reason why up till now the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has not forced countries to make greenhouse gas inventories of hydropower like they have for other energy sources. And part of the reason that, besides the political reasons, part of the reason that's been the case is because of the uncertainty surrounding our measurement, our ability to measure methane emissions. So essentially the last few years of my work, most of my academic career has been addressing these uncertainties in methane emissions from natural as well as impounded waters. So to outline my talk, it's in 4 parts. We're going to start with quantifying these emission pathways of diffusion and ebullition and see how important they are to the overall emissions in certain systems. Then we're going to look at the spatial heterogeneity of these emissions, both pathways, and look at how they're spatially heterogeneous and why, and how that can affect upscaling efforts. We'll then look at some potential environmental emission drivers that could help us when upscaling emissions at larger scales, and help us to make better predictions with potential environmental changes in the future. And finally, we'll look at 2 major, basically case studies of global impacts from different types of systems. So let's start with quantifying methane emissions. So as I said earlier, methane is produced in the anoxic sediments of lakes. body's water, and it's diffused out to the water column, and it can also be emitted as bubbles. And when these bubbles are rising, one thing I need to point out is that they're actually exchanging gases with the ambient water as they travel, so you'll have some dissolution of methane into the water column. What I want to show here, though, is right now I'm showing you a representation of a lake. So this lake could potentially be vertically stratified, so you'll have some kind of oxycline here, you'll have anoxic bottom waters and oxic top waters. However, the first system that I looked at ebullition and methane dynamics in general was in what we call a run-of-the-river reservoir in Switzerland. You can see here the map of the river. The reservoir essentially just looks like a widened river, which is essentially what it was. And what we noticed when we measured there monthly over the course of a year was that we saw not vertical stratification, but horizontal stratification in this system. So it is just a run flow-through system. So we treated it as sort of, we used it as like a plug flow reactor, and we came up with a system analysis to determine what was causing this accumulation in these waters. There's two sources. One would be the diffusion of the methane into the sediments, out of the sediments into the water column, and then the dissolution of those rising bubbles, which we knew that this system bubbled quite a lot. So essentially what we found was that the sediment diffusion was nearly constant throughout the course of the year, more or less, and at a very low rate. But this accumulation that we saw across the year correlated highly with temperature. Now, if diffusion is staying constant, then that means that correlation comes mostly from the bubbling. So essentially what we were able to do was say that the dissolution of bubbles was contributing that methane to the system, and then back calculate to the bubbling emissions. And what we found was that integrating this over a year, spatially along this reservoir, that the bubbling emissions contributed about 80% to the total methane emissions from this system. Total in red, bubbling in black throughout the course of the year. So now this is a system analysis that integrated somewhat indirectly the emissions, spatially and temporally, of this system. But this was very important in the sense that this was the rates that we provided here were about the highest reported at the time for any temperate system. Until then, tropical systems were thought to be the biggest dominant contributors of methane via any pathway. But we showed that a temperate system was very important. And so this actually, the press release of this paper had some coverage because of this very this very reason, was that temperate reservoirs were now shown, and run-of-the-river reservoirs were now shown to potentially be methane contributors. Now, like I said, the system analysis I just showed you was sort of measuring methane indirectly, more or less, or the bubbling indirectly, but you can measure ebullition more directly, and we did that also in this system. We were able to corroborate the system analysis ebullition measurements with direct measurements of gas trap sampling using inverted funnels. You can use inverted funnels, either automatic or manual sampling funnels. So we did an area-weighted upscaling with the traps, and we're able to corroborate our system analysis measurements. But then we also used other types of methods, such as eddy covariance tower in the middle of the lake, and floating chambers. And what was interesting about this, eddy covariance measures the velocities, the 3D air velocity, and whatever gas that you want in the atmosphere above, whatever you want to measure. So it's measuring basically what's above the atmosphere, or in the atmosphere above your source. And the chambers will lie on the surface of the water, and they'll collect methane bubbles and diffusion. And when we use those in a very bubbly area of this reservoir, we found that the eddy covariance fluxes here shown in per direction of wind, that at the peak where it was coming from, the peak area where the bubbles were and where our chambers were, that we got a peak eddy flux that corresponded nicely with our chamber fluxes, and that also corresponded with the system analysis and those gas traps. So these are some more direct ways to measure ebullition, and then there is one more that I spent a lot of time on during my PhD, and that was measuring ebullition using hydroacoustics. So basically I'm going to summarize a lot of work down in this one little slide into 3 steps for you. Essentially, to measure methane with hydroacoustics or an echo sounder is very similar to how fish biologists have been measuring fish biomass since the 70s, essentially, for decades. So you first look at your echogram here, and you need to distinguish between fish and bubbles. Bubbles tend to be these rising tracks at an angle, and fish will stay more horizontal in your echogram. fish schools will tend to look like blobs like this, and you can also have bubble plumes that look somewhat like blobs as well. But anyway, there's a lot of work that goes behind this, but then you can distinguish between the bubbles in the fish, and you get bubble density. And then you need to know what the echo sounder is telling you in terms of bubble size or volume. You can't convert the density to a gas volume without knowing the gas volume. So we calibrated our echo sounder using a series of bubbles that we knew of known size and related that to what the echo sounder sees, which is a back scattering cross section. And then we can convert our bubble density to a gas flux, but for the most part, the best data with this hydroacoustic evaluation is at the bottom of those seabed, at the bottom of the lake bed, close to the bottom. So we need to know how much methane is getting to the surface. To do that, we use a dissolution model created by a colleague of mine, Dan McGinnis. And we, for example, here, this model will puts out how much methane will reach the surface with a certain size bubble released from a certain depth. So a 6 millimeter bubble, this red line here, which is an average size of bubbles in the nature. When it's released from 20 meters, if it had 100% methane at the bottom, it'll have 40% methane when it reaches the surface. So essentially all of that goes into giving us methane bubble flux. What's also interesting about this technique, though, and we used it, was to look at the spatial heterogeneity of ebullition in more detail. Instead of just having point sources of traps, where you collect some volumes, you can actually run your sonar through the water and see what, see what the bubbles are looking like in certain areas. So one summer we focused in this system in the most bubbly part of the reservoir, and the predominant thing we found was that the bubble size in that region was what controlled the flux variability. That sounds, maybe it would be kind of intuitive, but sometimes not so. But what you're seeing here is the same system scanned several days, and each of these circles, the size of the circle is the average bubble size in that segment that we were looking at, and the colors relate to flux, so warmer colors, higher flux. So while yes, you tend to see bigger bubbles, warmer colors, higher flux, it's not always the same, and it changed day to day. And all I want to show, what I want to point out with this slide is that you cannot neglect the spatial variability that you see in the bubbling emissions. So ebullition hotspots can occur at multiple scales. So in this reservoir, we thought that this one system, this one area, was the ebullition hotspot. And then when you look into smaller scales, you see that there are multiple hotspots, and they move throughout the day or throughout the days. So essentially, neglecting these small-scale variability will result potentially in inaccurate estimations. So if we take all of the fluxes that I saw over the course of those days, take that average, 850, and multiply it by this area that we were scanning, we get about 0.11 tons of methane per day. However, if we ignored some of the higher fluxes, we could be underestimating by 10 to 20%. If we somehow neglected to get any of those high fluxes and we're just measuring small fluxes, we just put a chamber in an area and just got one small measurement, and then upscale that, we could be underestimating, in this case, by 75%. Conversely, if you measure only a high flux area and then upscale with that, you're going to make inaccurate estimates as well, overestimates. But in terms of not neglecting methane ebullition estimates, there's no better example I have from this than Lake Kariba. Lake Kariba is one of the largest reservoirs in the world. It's on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe along the Zambezi River. Its surface area is about 5,400 square kilometers, which means it's about a quarter of the size of Lake Ontario. And when we went down there to look for bubbling, we needed to determine where we would potentially find ebullition. So for that, we decided to go towards the river inlets, and I'll get into why that is in a little bit. But we went and looked at river inlets to see if there was ebullition there. It's the shallowest parts of the reservoir, etc. So we expected to see bubbling. We indeed found bubbling in river inlets. We measured bubbling with hydroacoustics in a bunch of inlets. And then when we upscaled to just the regions that we thought would be bubbling, based on river and tributaries, it ended up being just about less than 5% of the lake area. But when we compared those bubbling emission estimates to diffusion from this entire lake surface, as well as emissions coming out of the dam from the water released from the dam, we can see that ebullition releases 50 to 100 times more methane from that ebullition releases 50 times more methane than the other pathways. And that's only from 5% of the lake area. So I think it's fair to say that neglecting ebullition may possibly end up with an underestimate. But what about the spatial variability of diffusion? So just diffusive estimates at the surface of our lakes. So we do know now, there's been a bit more work, that the concentrations of methane in the surface vary spatially. But one important question is why we have methane in the surface of these waters. So just about every body of water we go to, we measure methane in the surface of those waters, despite the fact that those waters are oxygenated. Remember I told you earlier that methane has this important sink, where in the presence of oxygen is converted to CO2. But still, in every case, just about every case, I challenge you to find me a paper where we don't find methane in the surface waters. But in every case, we find methane in the surface of the water, which I would assume in a small lake, you could see that. Because in a small lake, you'd be close to where the methane is produced. Methane is produced again in the sediments. And then it can be transferred via bubbling or diffusion up to the surface waters and from the side. But in a really large lake, where you're up to kilometers away from the shore and you're tens to hundreds of meters away from the bottom, we still find methane in these lakes. And one of the reasons that this could be, that has been proposed in the literature, is littoral advection. So that we're transferring methane that is produced and emitted on the sides in the littoral zones of the lake towards the center of the lake. And if that's the case, and people have shown this, then you should see a decrease in methane from the shore towards the center of the lake. And we indeed see this when we sample in our lakes here. So this is a study I did here in Quebec and elsewhere over several lakes. These are just a few examples. But to show you that in every case, when we look at the distance from shore of 0, you're at the shore towards the center of the lake, we're going to see this exponential decline in methane at anywhere from 80 meters away, 500 meters, up to 6,000 meters away in the lake. You'll still see supersaturated methane content, and you'll see this exponential decline. Very slightly here and there, but an exponential decline in methane. So, in order to test this littoral advection theory, we put together, we had to first think, what are the physical processes that would control the distribution of methane physically in the surface waters? The first one would be horizontal dispersion. So this is it's represented by the dispersion equation here. So it's just the dispersion from the side, a 2-dimensional dispersion. And then gas evasion. So there's methane on the surface. It will always be emitting to the atmosphere as long as it's higher than the atmospheric concentration. So we need to incorporate also the equation for Fick's first law of diffusion for gas diffusion. So basically we put this together, set a steady state model. We essentially come up with the fact that the concentration at any point x will be equal to the input times the exponential of our gas evasion coefficient divided by the thickness of the surface layer that we're talking about divided by the horizontal dispersion coefficient. So when we do that, see that we do end up with this exponential decline in surface concentration from the shore towards the center. However, it's not only physical processes acting upon this methane. There are biological processes that probably modulate this distribution that we see. The first one being loss via oxidation. You are in oxic waters. I cannot neglect the fact that oxidation might be occurring. So in order to do that, we can add oxidation to our equation as a loss term, and you can see that the shape of the distribution remains the same, but we have a little bit less concentration towards the center. And then there's one other biological process that has now come to light in recent years, and that is the potential for methane production in oxic waters. There are various theories for what could be causing this. They essentially call it the methane paradox. We've seen it in the oceans for years now, and now we're seeing it in lakes. But essentially, there could be several ways that this methane is produced, but regardless of that, I'm just going to say that it could be, and put it in as into my equation as an additive term. And so when we do that, we would just say that the concentration, again, it still maintains the same shape, but is a little bit higher in concentration. But as you can see, that if you just went out and measured methane concentration, all you're going to see is this shape. You don't know by how much these biological processes are potentially modulating those distributions. However, if you use isotopes, the stable carbon isotopes of methane, the signature in methane, then you could potentially parse out the contribution from these biological processes. So, for example, if we're just worried about physics, if physics alone is acting upon this methane, then you should see no change in the delta C13 signature of the methane as you go across. However, if oxidation is occurring, you should see an increasingly enriched term as C12 is preferentially taken up by methanotrophs. You'll see an increasingly heavy signature. And then for production, the predominant theories behind the production pathways at the moment say that you should get, you'll be adding a more depleted C13 signature to your pool of methane. So then you should get a negative decline here if production is incorporating, is contributing to your surface distribution. Now, to be honest, both of these processes are probably occurring also at the same time. So we're still working on this to try and parse out these contributions. But essentially, these things, physical processes in the bio, will shape the distribution of methane that we see, and the biological processes will modulate approximately what we see in terms of concentration, which allows us to, if these models are correct, will allow us to do some better upscaling in the future as well. For the most part, large-scale lake surveys go to one lake and measure one point in the middle of the lake. And if you're measuring one point in the middle of the lake and it happens to be the lowest concentration and then upscale that, again, this could be a source of error for upscaling emission estimates also. So that leads me to what potential environmental emission drivers could be also driving our emission pathways. So let's first think about what you need for methanogenesis besides the archaea that produce it, the methanogens, and that is the organic substrate. You need that organic substrate in your sediments in order to degrade. So what we found in Lake Wohlen, again, if we go back to Switzerland, was that essentially the high sedimentation rates that occur in this reservoir and occur in many reservoirs, that these high sedimentation rates is what was making this reservoir such a substantial methane emitter. And one way we looked at that was by taking cores along the reservoir, and this is just one example, of a 60-centimeter core from Lake Wohlen. And what we show here is that the entire 60 centimeters is full of very labile organic matter. This is using a degradation index that measures the amino acid composition of the organic matter present. But essentially, if you compare this core, we have 60 centimeters of labile organic matter compared to 10 centimeters in a lake in a similar region. So essentially, the theory is then that this high rate of labile organic material, sedimentations of labile organic material, induces so much methane production that it overwhelms the amount that can actually diffuse out of the sediments. You get a supersaturation of methane in those sediments, and then you end up with this high bubbling, these high bubbling rates. We've also been working on other projects. We've used this theory of sediment trapping in reservoirs and found that this is similar in other systems. This is worked on a project with some people in Germany, and we did 100 kilometers downstream of a river, the River Saar, and it's segmented by a series of dams. And behind each, right as we were coming up to each dam, you can see these high ebullition rates. And essentially, the sediment accumulation rate in these reservoirs in this river matched quite nicely, correlated quite well with the ebullition rates also. And then these ebullition hotspots also dominated those overall methane emissions. And finally, in a natural lake, we also saw that sedimentation played an important role in methane dynamics. So this was working on the Rhone River Delta, so when the Rhone River enters into Lake Geneva, and it created, when the Rhone River it's been displaced many times over the course of its history, naturally and anthropogenically, and it's formed about 9 different subaquatic canyons. The active canyon is this one here. And what we did was looked at a series of cores across these canyons And basically what we found was that in the active canyon, we most certainly had the most methane compared to the other canyons, and more variable. That corresponded with a decrease in porosity, so lower, more porous, less porous, sandier sediments in the active canyon. And while the organic carbon percentage in those cores stayed the same, that didn't change, the organic carbon was more terrestrial sourced in the active canyon than in the eastern canyon. So this is using the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So essentially we had more terrestrial plant-dominated carbon here and more algal-derived carbon later on. And what was also interesting is working with the geologists there, that we also found that the highest levels of methane were commonly found in turbidite layers, which are essentially flood layers. So whenever there was a flood, outlined here in this pictogram with this yellow area, but you can see these, I don't know if you can see it, but these are much bigger grains here, and then these are bubbles here. When we cut the core was actually degassing. So essentially, sedimentation plays a big role environmentally in where these ebullition emissions come from, or where emissions come from in general. But we've also found that in the literature, we have and others, that methane emissions tend to correlate with water or sediment temperature across aquatic systems. I showed you in that earlier in Lake Boland that we saw an accumulation of methane that correlated with temperature, that we assumed was because of the bubbling that was correlated with temperature. But others have found that in subarctic lakes, that measuring bubble flux directly showed a very nice correlation with sediment temperature. And then a big meta-analysis showed that ecosystem methane flux, diffusive flux, correlated with water temperature as well. However, when we went to sample lakes and ponds in the north of Quebec, different areas of Quebec, we found that in the ponds, which are predominantly beaver ponds, that methane diffusion and ebullition did correlate with temperature. However, the lakes did not. So the diffusive and the bubbling fluxes in gray did not correlate with temperature, while the emissions from the ponds did. The primary difference between these ponds and lakes was that the ponds were more nutrient-rich and subsequently more productive than those lakes. So when we took those lakes and divide them out by their total phosphorus content, proxy for their productivity essentially, you can see that we had 3 quite different phosphorus levels for these 3 lakes, and that they correlated differently, their slopes are different, they correlated differently with sediment temperature. If we plot those slopes out here, you can see that we have an increasing amount of TP with an increasing amount of slope, and then the ponds are way up here. So essentially, what this is saying is that the temperature dependency of the emissions depends on the nutrient state of the system. And the best model, when we did a multiple regression model, modeling for this, we found that the best model was one that included a TP term and a temperature term, but also an interaction term. So it was an interaction between this TP and temperature. So essentially, the more productive systems here exhibit a greater temperature dependency in terms of emissions. And just to put this a little bit more visually, if I take a low nutrient lake, so we have a low TP on the left side, and we have a high TP lake, or high eutrophic lake on the right side, and look at what the emissions do according to different sediment temperatures, you can see right away that the eutrophic lake is going to have much higher emissions and much higher contribution from bubbling emissions. So essentially, under warming conditions, eutrophic systems will emit overall more methane than less productive ones. And this is important to remember as we enter, or already have entered, the era of climate change. The fact that eutrophication may then positively feed back on climate change. If we have changes in precipitation that are increasing amounts of carbon and nutrient runoff to systems, we may, and then as well as increased warming, we may end up with more degradation of this carbon, more degradation, and higher methane emissions, which would be a positive feedback back to climate change. So, does any of this matter? Let's see. Yeah. If we look at, let's do some global impact upscaling now. If I'm going to start in the boreal zone, it's the 4th largest biome in the world, and it stores approximately 1/3 to, estimates vary, 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's terrestrial carbon. It also holds the most water. It's the biome that holds the most water. Approximately 28% of continental water is located in the boreal zone. Now, using this map, which comes from this paper, the data from this paper, we were able to delineate all the lakes in the boreal zone. So there's 9 million lakes covering 1 million square kilometers of land. And using various estimates, various models for diffusive methane emissions and ebullitive methane emissions, using remotely sensed variables such as air temperature, solar radiation, and lake area. Sorry. We're able to come up with an estimate of how much methane is emitted in total from the boreal lakes. What we find is about 3 to 6 teragrams of methane per year. This is somewhat of a preliminary estimate, but about 3 to 6 teragrams of methane per year, which you can see is much smaller than the 64 with a range of 20 to 130 teragrams per year that they say comes from this other category. But in terms of total lake contributions, the current estimate for how much methane is coming from lakes, boreal lakes are about 5% of that estimate. And in total, natural sources, boreal lakes may only be about 2.5% of the natural anthropogenic, natural sources of methane to the atmosphere. Not insignificant, but not huge. But I was also recently involved in a synthesis of greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. And this was, again, synthesizing data in the already published data, reported literature, of greenhouse gas emissions, all emissions from all types of reservoirs, not just hydropower in this case, but also drinking and agriculture. What we found about 75 reservoirs with diffusive and ebullitive emission estimates. On the whole, they're per area emissions, so meters squared per day. And this map just shows you where those reservoirs are located. On a per area emission rate, it was about 25% higher than what has been measured before. And that's mostly because these estimates now include ebullition, which was not included prior. Another interesting thing that came out of this synthesis was the fact that we found that eutrophic, more productive reservoirs were the largest greenhouse gas emitters as well. So here we separated all of these reservoirs out by their trophic status, and you can see that eutrophic reservoirs are emitting far more methane, greenhouse gases, mostly in the form of methane. And essentially, for all the reservoirs put together, the methane comprised about 80% of their global warming potential, meaning that the methane emissions were the most important of all the gases being emitted. So if we upscale that to the current known reservoir surface globally, we come up with an estimate that's about reservoirs contribute approximately 5% of the anthropogenic methane currently. So 5% with all the other estimates you can see here. However, hydropower reservoir surfaces are expected to potentially double in the coming decades. This map here shows you in blue all the dams currently under construction, in red all the dams planned. Right now, hydropower accounts for 20% of the world's energy. However, if this is correct and estimates are correct, we may be increasing our capacity worldwide of hydropower by about 73%, which would further be reducing free-flowing rivers by about 20%. And that is why, believe this, and all the work we've done thus far on greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs, that is why the IPCC now is finally, probably, most likely, I believe, going to require national greenhouse gas inventories of hydropower, just as they do for other energy sources, which you can imagine is a little bit of a still political issue. So, in summary, I believe I have showed you that ebullition can disproportionately emit more methane than diffusion, and that it's an important pathway that should not be neglected. Neither should its spatial variability, although it's hard to measure. Physical processes in the surface waters mostly govern our diffusive methane emissions and the distribution there, which would help with potential upscaling if that modeling is correct as well. Essentially, methane dynamics can be heavily driven by sedimentation. So if sedimentation regimes change in regions, that will change potentially your methane emission rates as well. Eutrophic systems emit more methane than oligotrophic ones, so more productive systems emit more methane, and they are more temperature sensitive, which does not bode well for a warming climate. I showed you a preliminary estimate on boreal lakes, but they may not emit as much methane as previously thought. I didn't say that, but these emission estimates were slightly smaller than previous estimates. But these could change again in a warming climate. And finally, reservoirs, particularly eutrophic ones, emit methane at non-negligible amounts, and global estimates are likely to rise, considering hydropower will be most likely increasing in years to come. So I have plenty of acknowledgements. A lot of this work could not have been done without many people, so I thank all of my collaborators, co-authors, students, and field and lab assistants.